will be a world after coronavirus. We won't be in the state of pandemic forever. And today we want to ask our colleague, Professor Vivien Schmidt, about what that world might look like for Europe.
So what would the world look like, or what would Europe look like after the coronavirus? And actually, I have three scenarios. One is a bright scenario. The EU does more and very well, the things that it's already been doing. I have a darker scenario, which would be that the EU does very little and it does it badly. And then a kind of gray scenario where it only does just enough, the muddling through. So many might think that the gray scenario, muddling through, is what will happen, and that's the most likely. But I would prefer to look on the bright side. And what would that be? It would be that the EU deepens its integration even more in all the necessary ways without deepening too much, because issues of national sovereignty, democracy remain in play. But it needs to do more, integrate more to fight the pandemic, but not just to fight the pandemic. It also needs to address the other challenges it faces. There's still the refugee migrant crisis where nothing much has been done as yet. Brexit is now in limbo. Security. The EU is in a very bad neighborhood. And that also links to the migrant and refugee crisis, because not only can we talk about wars in the Middle East, but we've also got the continent of Africa, where it's predicted to have exploding demographics and issues of water, desertification, which takes us, of course, to climate change, which remains the biggest crisis facing not just Europe, but the world. And how does Europe tackle that? And of course, finally, the pandemic on its own, leaving aside these other things, is going to bring with it a massive economic crisis. Fortunately or unfortunately, this is a symmetrical shock. All countries are affected by the pandemic in terms of physical health, but also economic health. And so the question becomes, how do they emerge better? How does the EU solve the problem of the pandemic economic crisis and also pull itself out of the Eurozone crisis, which has continued? The European Central Bank, which has gone very far with the Eurozone crisis, was seen as the hero, essentially, of the Eurozone crisis, could do more. ECB is doing quantitative easing now. It could do even a bigger quantitative easing. Or helicopter money is a term that people use, which is essentially printing money and sending it out to people. 1,200 euros to every citizen in need. National governments are already doing this, but that money is going to run out, and that's where the ECB would need to step in. On top of that, we need Corona bonds, or I like to call them orange bonds, because we need green bonds as well. So it's called orange and green bonds. But the problem is that so far, the major responses have been at the national level, and there is a resistance. So what about the darker side? Brexit is still there. There's a security crisis. If a national focus trumps the EU and EU common response, we've already seen that in terms of closed borders on emergency medical supplies. Italy asking for ventilators, and Germany and France saying, sorry guys, we need it for ourselves. So if the ECB doesn't act, if the Commission bungles the response with what few resources it has, and if because of popular citizen anger in different countries, if you get populist nationalists elected, which is quite possible, then it's even worse, because the economic crisis that will be a recession could become a depression. If Italy goes bankrupt, it reneges on its loans, it's out of the Eurozone. And the minute Italy's out of the Eurozone is likely to break apart, because it's a major player in that. And then the EU could fall apart. I would like to hope that is a more functional and effective EU, but given recent history, I fear that it's going to be a, a gray future. That requires leadership. And unfortunately, we haven't had enough of it of late.